Welcome to this final encounter with the risen Lord, the Ascension. I'm not sure it's always considered in one of the resurrection, post-resurrection appearances, but in our setting, it makes all the sense in the world. All of these other encounters that we've experienced have brought us to this point, and I think we will come away with a sense of this is indeed what it was all about, to prepare us. Let's recap. Our first encounter was the women at the tomb. In each of our encounters, we featured a character who accessed the story for us, some art, some music, and a takeaway. In this case, the women who went to the tomb comes from Matthew's version. It was Mary and the other Mary. And we spent a good deal of time on that because in her not truly being named, she becomes a representative for us of all the women who followed Jesus, both named and unnamed. And in fact, down through the centuries, all those folks who have followed Jesus, folks like ourselves, known and unknown. The art was a little hard to come by because rarely do we see depictions of just two women that then also have the angel on the tomb, maybe even the guards scattered about. But it's because this version of the resurrection is rarely read in a church setting. Our music was Betsy's version of Roll Away the Stone that she filmed for us in Israel. Thank you again, Betsy. So delightful. We're invited to consider all those things they are now saying that the resurrection reverses. And the takeaway was to go and tell the good news. Our second encounter was Mary Magdalene in the garden with Jesus. And so she's our main character. There were so many pictures of her that we went through to kind of enter into the scene. I've chosen Fra Angelico because I like it. And the music was Carrie Job's song, The Garden. We spent, as far as takeaways, we spent a lot of time on that phrase in the garden, noli me tangere, and its depiction in art. What does it mean? Do not cling to me. You must let me go. What did that mean for Mary? What did it say about their relationship? What does it mean for us? Our third encounter was the disciples on the road to Emmaus. It is that scene from which we took our theme, picture, so to speak. And the main character was Clopas and his companion. A lot of time. Who was his companion? Who was Clopas? Was that Cleopas? Was the companion a wife? Was the meal a family dinner? So much speculation around that kind of broke open the story for us. And then the art did the same thing. We had Velázquez telling the story from a different point of view, that of the servant girl. And Levertov, the poet, building on that point of view, even as we entered the story from different points of view. Our songs were two. One was from the country western genre with He Walks With Me, and the other was from Black spirituality. I want Jesus to walk with me. And that's exactly the takeaway. We tended to linger on Jesus as a companion on this journey we call life. The next one, we combined the two stories of that take place in the upper room. Luke's upper room and John's doubting Thomas. So our main character, basically a single character, turned out to be Thomas, known as Doubting Thomas. The art we used was this incredible piece by Caravaggio, which just compels us into the scene. The music we chose was Stofford's Be Not Afraid for Jesus's message when he came into the upper room, and then later By His Wounds, because our takeaways or considerations were not only about the peace Jesus extended, but the way we realize that peace, which is to accept his invitation to explore our woundedness as a place where we encounter Christ. And our last one of time ago was Jesus at the shore by the Sea of Galilee. Our main character was Peter. We had two pieces of art. We had El Greco's Tears of St. Peter and Tintoretto's by the Sea of Galilee. Our music was My Jesus, I Love Thee, the invitation to speak our love to Jesus as did Peter, and a clip from Fiddler on the Roof, Do you love me? Tevye Ascolta, because that question is so pivotal to relationships, and we explored forgiveness and love and their dynamic tension. I'm going to be totally honest here about my first encounter with this story. As a child, you're going to think I was a very theological, nerdy kid, but I really pondered these stories. And okay, the Christmas story, Jesus was born, very, very good. He healed people, he taught people, all the things he did, that was very, very good. And then he died, and that was not good at all. But then he rose, and that was super good. And then comes this one. He leaves. This is not good. I don't know why it's called a feast. What do we celebrate here? I was a little put out at the ending to the story, what seemed to be the ending to the story. It has taken me decades to kind of come to an understanding of how the Ascension is good news, especially good news for here and for now and for you and for me. But let's listen to the story. A reading from the book of Acts. So when they had come together, they began asking him, saying, Lord, is it at this time that you are restoring the kingdom to Israel? But he said to them, It is not for you to know periods of time or appointed times which the Father has set by his own authority. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses, both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and as far as the remotest part of the earth. And after he had said these things, he was lifted up while they were watching, and a cloud took him up out of their sight. And as they were gazing intently into the sky while he was going, then behold, two men in white clothing stood beside them. And they said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up into the sky? This Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will come in the same way as you have watched him go into heaven. The word of the Lord. You know, we spend a good deal of time talking about who had been in the upper room and who will be in the upper room at the time of Pentecost. Who is at the scene of the Ascension? Again, there's some ambiguity. In fact, some commentators think that when Paul writes later there were 500 saw him at once, that could have been at the Ascension. There is no way of knowing. But we are beyond a head count here. This cosmic event that is the Ascension, it demands of us a totally new paradigm, a new way of thinking, one that is not bound by time or by space. And the church has long wrestled with what all of this means. In those first few years after the resurrection, in the early church trying to figure out the implications of resurrection, one of their primary concerns was for those who had died before the Christ event. Their own parents, other loved ones, the prophets of the Old Testament, etc. Were they saved by the redemption of Christ? Or had their coming before Christ excluded them from the hope of salvation? You see this in this icon. The first time I went into an Orthodox church, there was an icon very like this. And you'll often see these where Jesus is standing on the doors of hell, shaped like a cross, and he is pulling up from the grave the saints and others who have gone before, because this was a very real concern to them. You know, was it an accident of birth that precluded these from sharing in the benefits of the resurrection? As they pondered this, they took a deep Greek word, prolepsis, and they assigned a particularly theological meaning to it. Prolepsis is a verb, or proleptic as an adjective, is the opposite of an anachronism, which we were a little bit more familiar. To be an anachronistic would be an outdated or older object put in a later setting, like Captain Kirk using a pocket watch, for example. Proleptic, however, works in the other direction, time-wise. For example, on a debate team, when one anticipates the coming argument and prepares for it with a countering argument, that would be proleptic, a rebuttal, a refutation of an earlier assertion, reversing what came before. So as a theological term, put your minds around this, please, proleptic describes an event, the effect of which works backward in time. It is more than retroactive, because that works only in reverse. The Greeks had a complex understanding of time, much more multifaceted than our own. They had a whole tense, not just past, future, and present. They had a tense for actions which anticipated the future, as in a now, not yet kind of way. So to be proleptic meant to effect change backward in time, but also in the present and in future time. And as they thought about the Christ event, they began to use this specific word to specifically describe the effects of the resurrection. The early Christians came to the belief that Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection saved all peoples, even those who had lived before Christ, the peoples who lived at the time of Christ and were part of all that, and then into the future, unending. And just like the earlier icon that I spoke of and showed a representation of to you, this is frequently depicted in Orthodox icons. Is called the anastasis, referring to the resurrection. The resurrection at its key in this understanding is about the resurrection also of the dead, previous, present, and into the future. So this particular one is from the Greek Orthodox monastery in Kora, Istanbul. It's from the chapel there about the 1310-20s. So what you see is a very powerful Christ. See, he's in mid-stride, reaching out and taking the risks of, on the one, Adam and Eve to lift them from the depths of death. And on the left, there's an old King David and a younger King Solomon, even John the Baptist. To the right is Abel, who is seen as a precursor of Christ, and a collection of prophets. It's the concept being presented here that is so significant. It has nothing to do with historicity. But this painting makes a deep theological statement about the triumph of Christ over death and the saving effect of that for all humankind. So here we are, perched all these many centuries later, and we, like these early Christians, are left to ask essentially the same question. What does this whole Christ event, the passion, the death, the resurrection, and now the ascension of Jesus mean? Our immediate concern is just as immediate as theirs, though perhaps more future-oriented than past-oriented. I mean, do we look at all of this as simply an historical event? Or do we just raise it to the level as something to be remembered and celebrated? Or is it more? Does it have an effect on us here and now and beyond? So the character that we are exploring in this particular encounter is ourselves. And all of those with whom we share our particular setting, experiences, life, time, and place. I mean, could we not, just as legitimately as the iconographer who painted that Anastasis scene in Istanbul, create a scene wherein we gather those around the risen Christ? We might choose to gather our immediate family in that scene, our co-workers, our neighbors, those who sit alongside us in church, children in a classroom, construction workers on a high-rise, people caught in traffic, Asian workers in a rice paddy, maybe a Brazilian soccer team, at anything that represents the breadth of humanity, which is Jesus's reason for coming. In terms of a theological statement, as we're creating this collage in our minds, whom would we not include in the saving effect of Jesus' resurrection? And might we have that same mighty figure of Jesus clasping the hands of generations yet unborn, drawing out of uncertainty, obscurity, and fear a hoped-for future for ourselves and for our world. As Christians, we bring to bear two important beliefs: the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is a foundational event that changes all things. We are planted as part of God's purpose in the time and place wherein we find ourselves. In being tasked to find relevancy for our own time, we recognize that the world is much changed from that of some 2,000 years ago. One picture is worth 1,000 words. Geographically, the world, the ends of the earth, extends far beyond the Mediterranean world of Jesus' time. We know that it embraces a variety of people and cultures that were then unknown. And we now conceptualize ourselves as on a planet that is just a tiny part of a much larger universe. And we've plumbed questions of its origin, the origins of life itself. We recognize a discernible pattern of connectedness and evolution among all living things. And having divined the groundbreaking laws of physics, even these are now malleable in the light of relativity. And we bring all of these understandings of our world into the theological conversation around the Christ event. Seeing the universe as one interacting entity. So we explore the implications of the resurrection for all peoples, but also for all creation and for the natural world. If we are going to envision Jesus' saving action propelling us into a future at a time when the future can seem so tenuous, this is precisely the resurrection message that we need to hear in our own time. I'd like to share some excerpts from the work of some contemporary theologians that are a little challenging. You have to kind of wrap your mind around them, but so incredibly hopeful and truthfully at the heart of what we are talking about here. This first one comes from Paul Tillich, the philosopher and Lutheran theologian who died in 1965. And as he considered the implications of resurrection, he says, resurrection happens now, or it does not happen at all. It happens in us and around us, in soul and history, in nature and universe. His bodily resurrection embraces all of biological existence. And Jesus' victory over death is a statement of hope for all creation, that humanity is not, the world is not, meant for annihilation. Let's think for a moment here about what Tillich is saying, especially in a time like our own where we worry that even our own planet is in peril. This is not a time to abandon religion as irrelevant. It is at the very heart of our considerations. The redemption by Jesus Christ is not only of ourselves, it is not only beyond ourselves extended to all humanity, but it is for all of creation. And from another German, the Catholic Jesuit priest and theologian Karl Rahner, who was with us until 1995, come these words: "When the vessel of his body was shattered in death, Christ was poured out over all the world. He became actually, in his humanity, what he had always been according to his dignity, the heart of the world, the innermost center of creation." Christians have always believed that Jesus Christ was and is at the center of creation. Way back when Paul wrote to the Colossians, "For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth. All things have been created through him and for him." But with our new consciousness of what creation entails comes a new awareness of what Jesus' saving action is all about. And we are required to think beyond the confines of space, that is to say, our own bodies, thinking in terms of that resurrection. We're required to think beyond the confines of time, which is to say the current moment, or even the received tradition out of the past, and into the future, a place where Jesus also dwells in a new and empowering way. Ilia Delio, a Franciscan sister, an American contemporary writing right here and now, speaks to this. In her book, The Emergent Christ, she asks, how do we understand Christ's return with the belief that Christ is risen? Not has risen or will rise, but is risen now in the present moment. What does this mean for us, for the earth, the planet, and the cosmos? The message of Easter is a claim that something new has come into the world from its future. These theologians are far brighter than I, but I find their questions not only very challenging, but also extremely hopeful. And I commend these thoughts to you for your consideration as to what does all this mean. It takes time to arrive at that answer. If we consider those days that the disciples had between the resurrection and the ascension, it was necessary for them to just kind of absorb what had happened. And at the ascension, we can see they were still, if you go back to that story, expecting that Jesus was going to fulfill their messianic hopes. And he had something so much more in mind. They were in a conundrum, all of them together, much like the one Mary Magdalene had in that encounter in the garden. "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father," Jesus says to Mary. And that ascension he's talking about, the returning to the Father, was somehow necessary, but it was beyond Mary's understanding at the time, or theirs at the scene of the ascension, perhaps even our own understanding. But without ascending, then this risen Jesus is still present and embodied only within a particular place and time. It's only after and because of the ascension that Jesus is present in a kind of forever now that is the experience of every generation and people. We have access to the risen Lord, even as did his followers 2,000 years ago. It's the ascension that breaks the Christ event free from the bonds of history. It converts us to turn again to the beginning, that original premise, the question of what is God's purpose. And it is the ascension that reveals to us the eternal and cosmic proportions of this whole Christ event. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is not only an historical event, it is not only a religious belief, and it is certainly not just our ticket to heaven. It both empowers us and it challenges us. It is a game-changing realization that God so loved the world. It didn't just happen then, and it doesn't only happen now. It will continue to happen, to affect a future that we can't even imagine. And it speaks to God's divine purpose from all time to save what was created out of love and is destined by God for unity in love. Even all these centuries later, when we look at the human balance sheet, and it is at best still questionable, God is still at work. We can question and we can marvel at the intransigence, the hardness of the human heart, how long it takes for things to change. But Jesus says to us, as he says to them, it is not for us to know the time. Again, God is still at work. At a time when the future of our planet seems in peril, largely because of our own actions, the ascension of Christ to the Father raises our sights and reminds us that God has a purpose for all the natural world as well as for all peoples. And there is hope. Admittedly, that hope requires our collaboration. Remember, every witness that we were looking at cooperated in some way. Christ took the initiative and did not impose himself. There was a kind of an ordinariness about all of these appearances. Each one took place not in ecstasies or dreams or visions, but in reality. Jesus came to them where they were. And it just took tacit acceptance for Christ to become known to them and to make a difference. We live in a remarkable age, and to live faithfully, to embody hope, to create a future for our children. These are holy tasks. They don't come easily, and they aren't even always valued. But every age has met with their challenges, and ours is unique. It is our own. And God has put us here and uniquely equipped us for our challenges. Jesus comes to us even as he did to his followers. This post-ascension Jesus, who lives beyond the bounds of time and space, is available to us now, even as he was to them in their time. I want to thank all of you who have gone through this Easter season, visited these various resurrection encounters. I pray that they have blessed you. It has certainly been a blessing for me. They will be posted on my website, so you can go back to them for a long time. I don't know how long, but they'll be there. So you can always go back if there's some you've missed, whatever. You want to share them with other people, that's great. And on the newsletter within which the link to this came, there are other things, song, resources, and some questions I've put on there that I really would like you to ponder. And if you want to share your response with me, I'd be thrilled. Lastly, I'd just like to say a quick prayer in closing. Thank you is not enough, Lord, for all that you have done for me. But thank you is what I have to give you. Thank you for your dying and your rising. But thank you, too, for giving that to me right here, right now. And help me to never forget that I truly do belong to you, and nothing can separate me from your great love. Help me to live with that truth living inside of me. I love you, Jesus. Amen. God bless.